So sometimes governments will just introduce part of a buffer stock. So often, so the buffer stock has two main elements. One is to stop prices from falling, and that's generally to help suppliers. The other is to stop prices rising, which is generally to help consumers. So sometimes governments have attempted just to protect producers. Now that can be in countries where there are lots of individual small households that are producers, and they want to guarantee their income, because often in developing countries, agricultural producers and people living in rural areas, those are the people who are the poorest. So governments will sometimes say, well, look, we want to support these people, and what we're going to do is therefore we will introduce a guaranteed minimum price. So that's like part of our buffer stock scheme. Except that there's no price ceiling, there's only a price floor. So the idea is, what we do is we set a floor price. Usually that's above the current market equilibrium. Because normally we're trying to raise prices for producers. It doesn't have to be. You might use it as a long-term guarantee, but usually it's above the current equilibrium price. And essentially, the government then promises to buy any unsold units at that price. And that therefore prevents the price from falling. So it guarantees incomes for firms at the cost to the taxpayer. So let's look at how that might work on a diagram. I mean, a famous example. There's a recent example. About 5 years ago, the Thai government did it with rice. And there's been a more recent one with cashew nuts. I can't remember exactly where it was now. It's somewhere in Africa. Where governments basically have said, we guarantee this price and we'll buy anything that consumers don't. So how might that work? So what we're saying is that there is some sort of price floor. There's a guarantee. Let's say that the price floor is $100 per tonne or something. So what the government's saying is it will buy any unsold units at that price. So let's suppose that that's the level of demand and that's the level of supply. So in a free market, the price would be here at, say, $60. And quantity would be, say, 100 million. So normally, producers would be receiving 60 times 100, which is a lot. 6 billion dollars, which can be represented by that area here. But what we're saying is that we're going to just price times quantity. What we're saying is we're going to promise to producers that we're going to ensure that they receive a price of $100. So what's going to happen as a result? We promise $100. Well, producers are going to kind of go, well, great. I'll expand. That bit of marginal land that wasn't very good, it's worth me planting that now. I'll employ extra workers, so that I can harvest more. As a result of which, there's going to be an extension in supply. Supply increases. So instead of supply being 100 million units, it's now 130 million units. But of course, consumers aren't going to be happy at paying $100 per, whatever. So demand is going to contract. We're going to get a reduction in demand. Demand falls. Again, it's not a shift because it's just an increase in price. So demand falls. If we're originally in equilibrium there, supply rises to A and demand falls to B. So demand is now only, say, 70 million units. So at the guaranteed price, there's now excess supply of 60 million units. So there are some very unhappy producers because they've been guaranteed a price of $100. They're only selling 70 million. They've got all this unsold units. So what now has to happen is the government comes along and has to buy it. So the government has to say, well, look, that number of units there at the guaranteed minimum price, 60 million units, that's not been bought. Yeah, the consumers haven't bought it, therefore I'll have to buy it. And I'll have to pay $100. So the government has to pay, the government buys 60 million units and it buys them at $100. That's quite expensive. Yeah. So what, and we can show that on the diagram by saying they have to buy each one of those units has to be bought at $100. Yeah, so this area here, AB times the vertical distance there, that is the cost to the government. It has to buy that number of units at 60 million units at $100. The producer, of course, is delighted with all this. They used to have revenue of that area that we showed before, $60 times 100 million units. Now, their revenue is much, much higher. They're selling 130 million units, and they're getting $100 for each of them. So the revenue for the firm is now $100 times 130 million, 13 billion. So whereas before they had a revenue of 6 billion, now their revenue is the whole of that area there, of which this bit comes from the consumer. The consumers buy 70 million units at $100, the government buys the rest. Yeah, but their income is now at that level there. So what we've shown so far, is that one, the government buys that, there is a cost to the government that we showed as the kind of blue stripy area, which is we said 60 million times $100. And what we can now see is that producers, their revenue increases. Producers' revenue, it rises, so that it's now $100 for 130 million units. And we've shown that by kind of the large black outline. I'll now shade it in. It's the whole of that area there. So producers are happy. Taxpayers perhaps less so, on the basis that money that could have been used for health and education, is now being given to producers to grow stuff that nobody really wants to buy. And on top of that, of course, that's not the only cost. It's also worth bearing in mind that the government's going to have to store this stuff as well. So it's going to have to pay for storage. If we look at the impact on the consumer, they're going to be pretty unhappy because there's been an increase in the price that they have to pay, and as a result of which there will be a decrease in consumer surplus. So if we redraw the diagram and we say in the original situation, that was price quantity in equilibrium, consumer surplus would have been that area. The government comes in and now imposes a guaranteed minimum price, a floor price like that. We said, fine, supply goes up to there, demand falls to there, the government has to buy that bit. But what we can see is that consumer surplus is now only this top triangle. So consumer surplus is now only that area there because of the higher price. There's been a loss of consumer surplus of all of this sort of weird trapezium shaped thing here. All of that consumer surplus has been lost. And that's a combination of the fact that fewer units are bought, demand falls from Q1 to Q2, so consumer surplus is lost for that reason, and it's also lost because consumers are paying a higher price. So if we summarise then, what we can say is that what's good about this. If we say kind of what are our main plus points. There's an increase in farmers' incomes, and that can be quite good because they're often poor people in rural areas. So therefore it can help to decrease inequality, and it may mean that therefore they can invest. Which may reduce their dependency on the government and can increase, can shift your PPF, can increase potential growth. So there are reasons for doing it, But there are also serious, as well as, and another reason, another advantage is also, you could say that it also guarantees food supply as well. Yeah, so it's ensuring that, food safety or something. So food security. But there are clear downsides. Yeah, for consumers, we saw that there is a big decrease in consumer surplus. They're having to pay a much higher price. From the government's point of view, they've got to pay a lot of money, one, to buy it, and two, to store it. And that's a bit of a waste of resources. And we'll come back to this a bit later when we talk about the idea of government failure. When things go wrong when the government intervenes, and this can be a good example of it. Because in the case of the Thai example, they bought up a lot of rice. But then they never got to sell it, so it's just it just lay in warehouses until it rotted, really. And that's money that could have been used. That's money that could have been used elsewhere. So fundamentally, that's a bit of a misallocation of resources, a bit of waste of resources. Because we're using scarce resources to make something that nobody really wants. In the case of the EU and the US, rather than letting the stuff go to waste, what they tend to do is another risk is dumping. So what the US and EU have tended to do with their surplus products is to sell it on world markets. So it's essentially heavily subsidised, and that then damages producers in developing countries. So there have been famous cases where the US kind of dumped powdered milk on the Jamaican market, and that wiped out all of the local Jamaican dairy producers, the milk producers in the country itself. So these things create a lot of distortions, and usually, therefore, people see them as being politically motivated rather than economically.